Hello, class. Uh, Last time we were talking about how to formulate a research question. So let's finish up talking about the research process, all of these other steps that we take as we go through research. So the next step after we formulate a research question is to conduct a literature review. So this is something that's going to be an important skill to develop as a psychology major, to find some articles that are relevant to your topic of interest. And this is very important before you conduct a research study, because you might be reinventing the wheel. Someone might have done the research that you have already predicted, or the research that you're already planning to conduct. And that would be very problematic if you just do the exact same thing. I mean, it would be good for replication reasons, but it's important to know studies that are already out there. It's also important to know for methodology's sake. Maybe someone's encountered the same problem that you have, and maybe they found a solution for it. So you might benefit from your own research by examining the literature and other people's research. All right, so that's one of the reasons why this is important. One thing that's important for psychology articles is we want to make sure that the articles that we find are peer-reviewed. Peer review is a process, and we'll talk about a little bit more detail in this class a little bit later on. But what happens is when you want to submit an article, it just doesn't get published. Okay, it's got to go through a rigorous process in which other psychologists evaluate whether or not the research study was good or not. Typically, it gets sent to an action editor, an editor of a journal, and it might not be within their wheelhouse. It might not be a study that they know a ton about, but they find 3 or 2 different reviewers that are well familiar with the literature that this paper is going to be a part of. And those 3 reviewers write a critique of the paper, what the paper does well, what the paper does not well. And if the paper meets the standard of all of the reviewers, the paper is accepted and it is published. Okay, it's a very rigorous process. Between the time that you submit a paper and the time that the paper is actually published is typically about a period of 1 year, going through the review process again and again and again. So it's a little slow and arduous process, but it's very important that we find articles that are peer-reviewed. All right, this means that they're typically of higher quality than an article that is not peer-reviewed. So how do we conduct a literature review? There's no one way to do it, but here's some guidelines that I have developed in my time as a professor, or as a student of psychology, rather. The first thing that you want to do if you're interested in a topic is find a good review article. This will be a good introduction into the particular field that you might be most interested in. All right, here are some good examples of some journals that have good review articles. The Annual Review of Psychology. This thing comes out every year. It covers a variety of topics within psychology, and typically these articles do a very good job of being an overview of a pretty major discipline in psychology. Psychological Review and Psychological Bulletin. These are 2 APA, the American Psychological Association journals. They're typically pretty long and pretty in-depth. So these are typically very good articles, a little bit more specific than the annual review articles. And last, this is APS, which is the American Psychological Society. Their review articles come out in Perspectives on Psychological Science, and typically these articles are very good as well. I strongly recommend, if you're interested in a particular topic, to find an article about it in one of these 4 publications. There's other review articles or review journals out there, but these ones stand out in my mind. But after you read a overview, you read a general review article, you want to find the articles that make up, let me go back. You want to find the articles that really started it all, that started the discipline, the articles that everybody cites if they are talking about a particular topic. Okay, we call these in psychology, or just in science, seminal articles. These are articles that are very, very important. It might have started a discipline. It's an article that has had a very, very large impact. When you start poking around trying to figure out which papers to read, you might see that this one article is referenced a gajillion times. Thousands of times people reference this article. Well, you probably need to read that article. Okay, these are the seminal articles. Next thing that you need to do is make sure that you read these. All right. After you've got that under your belt, figure out the researchers that are the most prominent in a field. Okay, if you're interested in persuasion, who are the big names in persuasion? So once you figure those out, read a couple of those people's articles, make sure that you get a good grasp on the kind of research that they do. That's going to help you understand the discipline. And lastly, once you've done that, read a bunch of current articles within the past 2 years of the topic of interest. And then you have a pretty good grasp of what's going on in that particular discipline. But it takes some time, okay? Becoming an expert in a particular field of psychology is going to take a long period of time. It's going to take a lot of reading. But this is how you might generally conduct a literature review. All right. So next, let's talk about constructing a hypothesis. All right, constructing a hypothesis. Probably way back when you were in middle school or high school, you thought about a hypothesis as an educated guess, right? An educated prediction about the results of your research study. Sometimes you know what might happen, sometimes you might not know what happened. But what's important to think about right here is think about testing the difference between two theories. Think about if your results come out this one way, what would they tell about the phenomenon of interest? If the results go another way, what would it tell you? I think it's very important that researchers learn to conduct a study, and no matter what the results of the study, that the study's still going to be interesting. Okay, frame your research in such a way that no matter what the outcome, your research is going to tell something interesting. I have a number of friends that were very interested in some particular phenomenon within psychology, and if their study worked out, they've got a wonderful paper. If the study did not work out, it's going to be garbage, and it's really hard to make a career in psychology if that's what you're trying to do. So things like stereotype threat, that we'll talk a little bit later on in this class. If you find it, that's great. People will be very excited about that, but if you don't find it, then your paper is going to be very hard to publish it, even though it might be important to publish your paper. So try to frame your research in such a way that no matter what ends up happening, it's still going to tell us something useful about the topic of interest. Ultimately, what we're trying to get in psychology is to get some kind of scientific law. But very rarely are we going to find laws in psychology. A law is established within a science by repetitive experimental observation, and typically laws are expressed in a mathematical or quantitative formula. All right, think about laws of things like gravity, or think about many of the laws in chemistry or physics. These can be expressed mathematically. All right, we can make a mathematical prediction. We can use an equation to solve for things. I can think of all the laws in psychology on about one hand. There's not that many. Okay, we don't have this kind of quantitative specificity within our discipline. All right, there's some laws within the field of reaction time, some laws within the field of perception. Okay, but very rarely are we going to come up with something that we can express mathematically. But that's not too terribly important for us. Let's talk about what a scientific theory is. A scientific theory is a well-substantiated explanation of some natural phenomena. Okay, we typically use the word theory incorrectly in our everyday life. We think of something as, it's just a theory. All right, it's not anything important, it's just a guess. But that's not what a theory actually is in science. Okay, a theory has to be established by multiple observations, multiple experiments. All right, so we have to come up with multiple experiments that have to provide support for something before we can call it a theory. So what are some levels of understanding? Like, what do we get? How do we build our knowledge within a particular scientific discipline? Well, the first thing that we want to do is to come up with a description, to describe some kind of phenomenon, right? So what kind of behaviors occur? All right, maybe we come up with a classification system for these behaviors, for these certain characteristics of some psychological phenomenon. Think about the first studies in the discipline of personality. The first thing that we need to do before we can tell what personality traits predict which outcomes in life is to determine how many personality traits are there. What are the relationships between all the personality traits? So the first thing that we want to do in a scientific discipline is describe the phenomenon. All right. And after we describe the phenomenon, the next step that we want to get at is the step of prediction. We want to, given a certain situation, we want to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. If you raise your kid this one way, if you have this particular mindset, if you have this particular personality trait, what might happen in the future? If you study this way compared to this other way, how is that going to change an outcome in the future? That's the next step in knowledge within a scientific discipline. And once we can predict things, hopefully we can manipulate or control them in some way. Okay, maybe description, let's say that we're interested in something like mental illness. We might want to classify all the different mental disorders, right? How is this disorder different from this disorder? So we do first a level description. Then we want to look at things like prediction. So if we see that this particular neurotransmitter is off in the brain, the levels of the neurotransmitter is off, maybe that might predict depression, or maybe that might predict anxiety in some way. We know some relationships between the brain and mental disorders. Maybe it has to do something with how someone was raised or someone's personality traits, and that might predict mental illness in some way. Okay, next step is control. All right, maybe we can give somebody a SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and that might change their mood. Or if we change their levels of a particular neurotransmitter, maybe that changes their mood in life. Maybe if we change the situation that they're in, maybe that might change the outcomes of mental illness. So can we increase or decrease the incidence of whatever it is that we're studying? That's the next step of understanding. And once we do that, the final step here is a theory. Okay, we want to explain why a particular psychological phenomenon occurs. Okay, why do certain thoughts, feelings, and behavior occur? We might have some kind of theoretical framework as to why this occurs, have some explanation for this. All right, a theory is an attempt to explain scientific facts with ideas that are empirically testable. What do I mean here? A theory is a way to generate new research. All right, a theory should motivate scientists to come up with a new way of doing research. Okay, a theory isn't necessarily a bad thing. People have this idea in their mind that a theory is just some kind of guess. That's not what it is. All right, what are some qualities that make up a good theory? Well, the first thing that a theory needs to do is it needs to account for all the extant data. What do I mean by extant? It's the opposite of extinct. Extant means currently available. Okay, all of the data at that point in time. So if we wanted to come up with a new theory of schizophrenia, and why does schizophrenia occur? We want to be able to account for all the data that we already have in schizophrenia, right? That there's a huge genetic component to it, that there are some disturbances in the frontal lobes due to schizophrenia, that there are decrements in attention for individuals that suffer from schizophrenia. A good theory of schizophrenia should be able to account for all those things, all right? At the very least, it should be able to account for all of the scientific information that we have at that period of time. This is a very important quality of a theory. All theories need to be falsifiable. There needs to be some condition in which the theory would be wrong. If we were to able to find some data, it would prove the theory wrong or provide evidence that the theory is not correct. All right, for something to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. Okay, I could say that mental illness is due to these little tiny people that get into someone's brain and they screw everything up. But they're invisible, so you never see them. Okay, so someone might say, well, that's obviously a crazy idea. We can't, we open up the brain, we don't see those men. And I say, well, they're invisible. You're never going to see them. It's unscientific because there's no way to prove that idea wrong. Okay, another example of this is Freud's idea that repressed memories can cause mental illness in the future. Okay, so your early childhood was so traumatic that you have repressed memories. And so you might say, no, I don't remember anything. I don't remember any trauma early on in my life. That's not why I feel anxious. That's not why I feel depressed. Well, Freud says, well, they're repressed. You're never going to be able to uncover them. Again, this theory is not falsifiable, so it's not a good theory. Okay, there's no way that we can prove that theory wrong. So this is a very important quality for a theory. A theory has to be falsifiable. Another quality of a good theory is a theory has to be parsimonious. And what I mean by parsimonious is the theory needs to be simple. The simpler the theory, the better. Any kind of theory that we end up adopting must adhere to Occam's razor. This is named after a famous medieval philosopher, William of Ockham. And Occam's razor is this. Among competing hypotheses, so if we're trying to figure out which theory we want to adopt, the one that has the fewest assumptions should be selected. So we should go with the simplest theory. Let me give you an example of this. So here is my wife and my dog, Tara. She's rocking out her Christmas vest here. Very festive, Tara. And Tara, when I tell her, okay, go outside or go upstairs, she runs upstairs as she goes outside. Okay, it seems that she is very smart. I might say, and I might develop the theory that Tara actually understands the English language. All right, Tara understands English. But I could explain the same behavior a different way. All right, when I point to something, when my voice gets higher, Tara might be able to respond to that. And she knows, oh, if I'm getting dressed, that probably means that she needs to get in her crate for the day. All right. The first thing that we do in the morning is always go outside. So she might think that is when we get up, hey, Tara, do this. She knows, okay, I already know that we're probably going to go outside. Okay. So it could just be the timing of things, or it could be the case that she actually understands English. Which one of these is true? We're more likely to adopt the simpler explanation, that she does not know English. That would make many more assumptions. It's a much more complicated theory. Okay, so we're going to go with, in science, the simplest, the most parsimonious theory. Another important quality of a theory is that the theory should lead to new research. It should be able to predict new findings, okay, new ways to test the theory. Okay, there are old theories in psychology that do not account for the data nowadays. Okay, you might have learned in general psychology about the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory, which says that there's sensory memory, then there's short-term memory, and there's long-term memory. And information first comes in the sensory memory, and then it goes to short-term memory, and via the process of rehearsal, the longer it is in short-term memory, the more likely it is to go into long-term memory. This is one of the most classical models of memory. Immediately after Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed that model, data came out that it was wrong. Okay, so why do we keep talking about that? The Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory was important because it generated a lot of new predictions about what memory should be like. It generated a lot of new experiments in the discipline of memory. So even though it didn't account for the data in the best way, it generated a lot of important research studies. And that's something that a good theory will do. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about conducting a research study. Psychology is a very difficult discipline. In fact, I might argue that it's more difficult than something like physics, chemistry, or biology. All right. A lot of the things in physics, chemistry, and biology, you can directly observe. All right. You and I both can look at how many milliliters of a solution there are and come up with the same answer. Okay, we can calculate how far a rocket's going to go, and we can observe how far that rocket's goes and count it up in meters. Both you and I can come up with the same answer to that just by observing the outside world. But in psychology, most of the things that we're interested in are occurring within our heads. We can't directly measure them. I can't stick a thermometer up somebody's nose and measure their personality. All right, I can't directly measure someone's memory by looking inside their brain. All right, so we have to go about things very indirectly in the discipline of psychology. Most of the things that we're interested in psychology are hypothetical constructs. Hypothetical constructs are things that we assume exist, but we cannot directly measure or observe them. All right, how about something like love? How about something like intelligence, personality, whether or not someone's hungry, whether or not someone's paying attention or not, whether or not someone's angry. Now, we can see the outward manifestations of these things. Someone that's hungry wants to get a cheeseburger. Someone that's angry might shake or something like that. But we can't directly measure them because, again, these things are occurring inside the head. So we have to make them directly observable because science is all about things being observable. Something has to occur, and you and I and everybody around has to agree that this event occurred. Okay, it has to be publicly verifiable for it to be scientific. So what we do is, to measure these hypothetical constructs, we develop operational definitions. An operational definition, what we do is we tie a hypothetical construct to something that's directly observable. All right. My definition here is an operational definition is a definition that qualifies and quantifies a hypothetical construct so that it can be understood objectively. All right, let's do some examples here. So suppose we have this theory that frustration leads to anger. All right, this is the frustration aggression hypothesis. It was originally proposed by Dollard, but it is an important theory in the psychology of aggression. If there's frustration, then it leads to aggression. Frustration causes aggression. All right, how do we measure frustration? How do we measure aggression? How would we test this hypothesis? Again, we can't directly measure these things. So let me give you an example. Okay, how would we go about doing this? So let's say that right around when class ends, all right, and everybody's leaving the parking lot, we are going to manipulate frustration. We're going to operationally define our manipulation of frustration. We either let all the cars go at one time, and so they all get out in a timely manner, or we artificially create a bottleneck, and it takes people a whole lot longer to get out of the parking lot. Frustration is all about someone expects to be able to do something, and then you put a barrier in their way. That's how we might increase someone's frustration. So I'm operationally defining frustration by the amount of time that it takes you to get out in the parking lot. All right, are you able to get out there quick, or because of some manipulation that we've done, we've created an artificial bottleneck, and it takes people a lot of time to get out of the parking lot. Okay, so that's how we are manipulating the independent variable. This is how we're operationally defining frustration. But how about anger? How would we see anger in this situation? We could count the number of times that people yell. We could count the number of times that people lay on their horn. We could see how many people wave their middle finger in the air. All of these are directly observable things. We can see how many people flick somebody off. We can hear how many times someone lays on the horn. Okay, this might be one way in which we conceptualize anger for this particular experiment. But what I want you to know is that operational definitions are never the exact same thing as a hypothetical construct. People might lay on the horn as a way to say, hey, okay, hey, how's it going, right? It's not the exact same thing as aggression. Right? We might, what's another example of this? Someone flicking it off, maybe that's how two friends communicate hey to one another, all right? So we might see these things not necessarily as indicators of aggression. They might be something else. Some people might get angry and not lay on their horn, not flick anybody off. All right, so our measure of aggression here, our measure of anger, is not perfect. Any operational definition that we use is not going to be perfect. Okay, we try to make it as good as possible. We try to make it as good of a measure of a hypothetical construct as possible, but it's never going to be perfect. It has to be measurable, though. All right, does poor parenting cause anxiety in their children? Okay, this is a good psychology question. How are we going to operationalize poor parenting? People might have differences of opinion of this, but maybe we might say the amount of time that a parent spends with their child. Okay, that might be how we operationalize quality of parenting. Okay, maybe we might look at a record of abuse to get some indication of poor parenting. How do we look at anxiety in children? We have to operationalize that as well. Maybe we ask the child on a scale of 1 to 10 how anxious you are. But again, sometimes children are unable to answer these questions. Maybe they don't know what the word anxious means. Okay, maybe we look at it some other way. All right, we see how often that kid talks to other kids, right? Maybe if they're overly shy, that's an indication that they are more anxious. But again, these operational definitions are not going to be perfect, but we have to have some way in which we can directly measure something and hopefully infer something about that hypothetical construct. All right. When we are conducting a research, we need to define our variables of interest early on in the process. Our variables are things that might vary amongst the study. Okay, things that might vary among the research study. And again, this might be something that you've learned about many times, and I apologize for that, but I'm just trying to make sure that we're all on the same page. Independent variable. An independent variable is a variable that we manipulate. So we give somebody a drug, we give them the placebo. All right. In the example I was talking about earlier, we create an artificial bottleneck in the parking lot, or we let traffic flow normally. The independent variable is something that we are interested in typically when we are conducting an experiment, and it's something that the researcher manipulates to see if there's a change in the dependent measure or dependent variable. We might abbreviate these IVs and DVs, by the way. The dependent variable is the variable of interest. We're trying to see in an experiment if our different conditions lead to differences in the dependent measure, the dependent variable. All right, we're trying to see if changes in the independent variable cause changes in the dependent variable. Here, we might conduct a drug study to see if it impacts depression. So our dependent variable here would be levels of depression, maybe via a self-report. For our traffic study, our frustration aggression study, this might be the number of middle fingers in the air, and we try to see if it's different depending on our condition. Okay, we are interested in if the effects of the independent variable change the dependent variable. All right, but there's many other variables in a study as well. There's some things that we keep constant. All right, we might call these constants. We might call these control variables. For my frustration aggression hypothesis, we would want to control the time of day. All right, if we had the bottleneck at 12 o'clock midnight, there's nobody on campus. We're likely to get differences in the dependent variable, not due to our experimental manipulation, but due to the time of day. So we want to make sure that these things are as consistent as possible. All right, we try to have our research study in the ideal situation that the only thing that changes amongst our conditions is the independent variable and not anything else. Everything else is held constant. Okay, so control variables, things that we want to make sure are consistent throughout our study. But sometimes we can't control for everything. Sometimes we can't make sure that everything is consistent. Sometimes there are things that vary amongst our conditions that we don't really have control over. These are confounding variables. Sometimes we call them confounds, sometimes we call them extraneous variables, sometimes we call them nuisance variables. These are variables in which the researcher does not control for in the research study and might impact the interpretation of our results. All right, we might see a difference in our two experimental conditions, but it's really due to the confounding variable as opposed to the change in the independent variable. Confounds limit the interpretability of our research. Confounds ruin our research. Okay, so our job as experimenters, our job as researchers is to eliminate as many confounding variables as possible. And if we can't eliminate them, we try to control for them in some way. Maybe we measure these confounding variables and try to statistically control for them in the results of our study. All right, so for instance, if we were doing our frustration aggression study one day on Wednesday, another day on Friday, all right, people might be more anxious to get home on a Friday as opposed to a Wednesday. And that might lead to a difference in the result. And if we have not controlled for that, that would be a confounding variable. Perhaps it's the case that men and women differ on their levels of aggression. If there's more women one day and more men another day, that might be a potential confounding variable. And it might change the results of our study due to that confound and not due to the independent variable. All right, so we need to make sure we keep these things in mind, try to eliminate as many of the confounding variables as we can, or at least measure them and try to statistically control for them. All right, there's many different types of research designs. Okay, we have many different types of research designs. In this class, we're going to talk about three major ones. All right, let's try to answer the question, do violent video games cause players to be more violent? Okay. Does playing violent video games lead people to be more aggressive? This is an extremely researched topic in psychology. There are hundreds upon hundreds of studies about whether or not video games cause violence. We could try to tackle this question many different ways. We could try to tackle it with an experiment, a correlational study, or a quasi-experimental study. So let's talk about how these work. With an experimental design, with an experiment, the researcher actually manipulates the independent variable. That's the important key here. Whether or not the experimenter is in control of who receives which level of the independent variable. So to do a study like this, we might randomly select, go out into a population, grab some individuals that are going to participate in our study. Half of them, we get them to play a violent video game, maybe something like Call of Duty. And the other half, we get them to play a video game that's not violent, maybe something like a Tetris, maybe something like an Animal Crossing. All right. So half of our subjects plays Call of Duty, the other half of them plays Tetris. It's the experimenter that's administering the level of the independent variable. You guys get to play the violent video game. You guys, I'm randomly assigning you to the control condition that you're playing Tetris. All right. It's the experimenter that has the control which person is in which condition, even though it's random. Okay. And then maybe we test who's more aggressive afterwards. In the old days of psychology, we might have people shocking one another, but IRBs, the Institutional Review Board that decides whether or not a research study is ethical or not, they typically don't like that. So in modern times, what we do is we have humans play loud noises for other human beings. Okay, if I want to aggress on you, I push a button and it plays a loud, unpleasant noise in your ear. Okay, or just something like annoying. Maybe it's Baby Shark. You guys have heard of that? Awful, awful song. So if we're doing some study, you play a violent video game, we see who's more likely to play Baby Shark in somebody else's ear. Okay, that's an experimental design. Again, the hallmark of this is that the experimenter, the researcher, has control over the independent variable. All right, let's contrast this with a correlational study. A correlational study, we're looking at the relationships between multiple dependent measures. The researcher does not control the independent variable. So we might look at the number of hours someone typically plays a violent video game a week. All right, so we calculate how many hours people play violent video games, and then we correlate that with how many times they behave in an aggressive manner. Maybe we go to an elementary school and we ask the children how often they play violent video games, and then we correlate that by how many times they punch other kids in the face. Okay, so that's our study. We can still ask the same research question, but we don't have complete control over the study. We're not manipulating how many hours of the video game people play. And there's a confound, there are a number of confounds that come into place for correlational studies. We are unable to prove causally that violent video games cause there to be more aggression. All right. It might be the case from our correlational study that we find a relationship, but it's the case that people that are already violent prefer violent video games. It's not the violent video games that cause the aggression. It's the fact that people that are already aggressive enjoy playing more violent video games. So violent video games don't cause aggression. It's some personality characteristic that causes both people to behave more aggressively and people to play violent video games. We are unable to tell that with our correlational study. And that's problematic. But with a correlational study, sometimes we were able to research things that we would typically not be able to study in lab, right? We could see how many times a kid punches another kid in the face, all right? We might ask a teacher something like that. In an experiment, we couldn't engineer a situation in the lab where kids punch each other, okay? You just can't do that. That's not ethical. That would not be good to do. But we could get reports from the kids about how many video games they play, how many violent video games they play, and they get a report from the teachers. So it's not like we're designing the situation where kids are going to beat up on one another. So with correlational research, even though we can't prove causality, we can't prove that one thing causes something else, we are able to examine some things that we might not be able to examine otherwise. All right, the last one, quasi-experimental design. There's a variety of quasi-experimental designs. The one that I'm going to talk about has to do with pre-existing conditions. All right, we are thinking about things in terms of groups. So you're in either group A or your group B. But these are groups that have already existed, that the researcher isn't able to assign you to a particular group. So we ask people, are they a video gamer? Do they play violent video games? Or do they not play violent video games? So we have our gamers and we have our non-gamers. And then we're going to measure their aggression in the lab. All right? So we're going to measure their aggression in the lab and see if there's a difference between those groups. All right? Since we don't manipulate the independent variable, since people are already gamers or already non-gamers, this is a quasi-experimental design. All right? And there are potential confounds that could go into this research study, right? People that are already gamers, maybe it's the case that they already have an elevated level of aggression. And so any differences that we see in our research study don't have to do with playing the violent video game. They have to do with something else. Okay. Other examples of some quasi-experimental designs, maybe we look at the difference between young adults and older adults. I can't randomly assign young adults to be old. I can't say, hey, you're going to be 80 years old today. I can't go to an 80-year-old and say, you're going to be 20 today. All right. I just have to take these individuals as they are. All right. So I might see differences in memory. I might see differences in attention. But let me talk about another study. Let's say that we have differences in technology usage between 80-year-olds and 20-year-olds. Does that have to do with the cognitive limitations of the 80-year-olds? Does this have to do with aging? Or does this have to do with the fact that 80-year-olds, when they grew up initially, they didn't have access to the kind of technology that we have access today? So we might see differences in cell phone usage. We might see differences in computer skills that has nothing to do with aging and has to do with experience when you were younger. All right. So there's a potential confound for this quasi-experimental design. But this doesn't mean that this research is not important, okay? Otherwise, we would have to wait a long period of time, conduct a longitudinal study to do this kind of research, all right? Check you out and measure some aspect of your psychology when you are 20 and wait 60 years to when you're 80. That's a long time. All right. And it's going to take a lot of resources, both financial and time-wise, to conduct that kind of research. So we might do this quasi-experimental design right here, where we take older adults and younger adults at the same moment in time. All right. And there's nothing wrong with doing that kind of research. It's still important research. How about if I'm looking at sex differences, the differences maybe in something like aggression between men and women? Okay, I can't randomly assign someone to be a man today or randomly assign them to be a woman. All right, these are already pre-existing conditions. So this kind of research we would call a quasi-experimental design. All right, what are some other important aspects about conducting a research study? All right, one thing is to make sure that things are consistent as possible. So typically before you conduct a research study, you develop a research protocol, which is a step-by-step sheet of paper or a series of instructions that the experimenter is going to follow when interacting with the subject. All right, you try to keep these things as consistent as possible. When I'm conducting my research, I don't want the instructions of my task to be explained differently between everybody. Okay, that's going to lead to some potential confounding variables where somebody might understand the task better than somebody else. So what I do a lot of times is I have the computer give the instructions, because the computer can give the instructions the exact same way every single time. But we follow this research protocol to minimize the influence of potential confounding variables. If we're interacting with subjects, sometimes we might follow a script. Okay, this has sentence by sentence everything that we're going to say to the subject, and we don't deviate from that. All right. Let me tell you about a research study that I was part of when I was you guys' age, when I was an undergraduate student. A professor of mine was doing research looking at autism spectrum disorder. Well, it was autism then, but autism spectrum disorder now. And she was looking at some of the hormone levels in mothers of autistic children to see if that might predict whether or not their kids would develop autism spectrum disorder. All right, looking at hormone levels. And so what we had to do is we had to measure this hormone by getting some blood. Of course, I wasn't doing this. I'm not a phlebotomist, but we would take a blood sample of mothers before they were stressed out and after they were stressed out. So my job was to stress out these poor mothers of autistic children. So how did we do this? All right, we had to follow this script. The person came in and they were to pretend that this was a job interview. And they were to tell us about their best qualities of themselves. All right, and our job was to give them nooch, to do absolutely nothing, to look at them with a stone face. All right, and typically they get pretty flustered at this. All right, and after this goes on for a little bit of time, we tell them to start counting backwards by sevens. All right, and give them some impossibly large number, maybe something like 2,385. Try counting backwards by sevens from 2,385. It's difficult. It makes you look dumb. All right, so again, we're giving them nooch. We're giving them absolute stone face. And this is designed, this protocol is designed to stress out these poor mothers. People have used this protocol in many different situations to manipulate stress level. All right. We did the same exact thing for every single mother. If they had a kid with autism, if they didn't have a kid with autism, because we had to be consistent. All right. We didn't want it to be the case that there's differences in this particular hormone because we stressed out mothers of autistic children more than mothers of non-autistic children, children without autistic spectrum disorder. All right, so that is why we did this sort of thing. We had to make sure that everything was consistent. Of course, we felt really bad about this. It was kind of a hard research study to do, but the results were very important. So it's hopefully the ends justify the means. All right. Speaking of ethics, before a subject starts the research study, they have to sign an informed consent. The informed consent presents the subjects with information about the study. what are the risks of the research study, what do they get out of the research study, so if is there any compensation, and also lets them know that at any point in time they can leave the research study without fear of losing their compensation. So at any point in time, the person can say, I'm done, and head on out. And they need to read through this informed consent and they sign it, all right? Sometimes we might have a study in which we lie to them about the actual thing that we're studying, and that's fine. But we need to make sure that the risk of the study, that they still understand what's going on, all right? They sign this informed consent before they can begin. This is a very important document that we have to obtain for every single subject. We have to keep a record of this. After the study, there is a debriefing form, all right, or we debrief the subject. This is where we tell them the true purposes of the study. For instance, if we lied to them in any way, what were the research hypotheses, and generally we clear up any misconceptions that the subject might have about the research study. Okay. Sometimes people are very interested as to what they were actually doing throughout the research study. So we might tell them and inform them about what it is that we are doing. And this is an important process, and it gets people excited about research. So that's a very important thing ethically, that they understand what the true purposes of the study were, and it helps them get excited and more likely to conduct or to volunteer for research studies in the future. All right. So next step, analyzing the data. This is a very important thing to do. And we're going to talk a lot about this when we get to the statistics part. But the point that I want to make right now is that you want to plan out the statistics that you want to conduct before you conduct your study. Okay, you want to plan the statistics that you want to conduct before you conduct your study. Because there's always some probability that you find a result that's just due to chance. Your experimental condition did better than your control group just due to chance. There's always, with the statistics that we conduct, there's always some probability that this occurs. It's around 5% with the way that we do our statistics in psychology. Now, if you conduct one study and one statistic, there's a 5% chance that you find the result and it's BS. Okay, if there's truly no difference between your two groups. All right, there's a 5% chance, if there's no difference, that it's going to come back and looks like there's actually a difference, just due to random chance. That's if you conduct one statistic. But if you conduct multiple statistics, the chance that at least one of them is going to come back as if there's truly a difference here is going to be greatly increased. We call this going fishing. All right, if you conduct a lot of statistical tests, one of them is going to show positive results just due to chance. Okay, so we need to make sure that we're conducting the statistics that we've planned before we began the study. Okay, the more statistical analyses that we conduct, the greater chance there is to find a false positive. Let me give you a great example of this. So this DiStefano et al. Study from 2004 is used many times to justify people not vaccinating their children. With this study, they looked at children and whether or not they were vaccinated or not vaccinated, and they found that specifically black boys, only black boys, had an elevated risk of developing autism spectrum disorder if they were vaccinated. Okay, and a lot of people are like, whoa, see, I knew I was right. Vaccines are horrible. So what's going on here with this study? Okay, well, they did one statistical analysis with all the children, all right, and no relationship between vaccinations and autism spectrum disorder. And they looked at little boys, and then they looked at little girls, and then they looked at all white children, and they looked at all black children, and then they looked at different racial makeups, different socioeconomic statuses. They looked at tons of different analyses. And if you conduct enough analyses, you will find some false positive. And that's what they found. All right. And a lot of people cling to this as evidence that vaccines truly cause autism spectrum disorder. All right. So is this a reason to panic? No. And in fact, if you were to find something like this after fishing through your data, you don't want to write home about it. You want to try to replicate it, okay? Because it could just be a false positive. And in fact, when researchers tried to replicate this finding, no one's able to replicate it, okay? It's completely and utterly a false positive, but if you conduct enough statistical analyses, you're liable to find something, okay? So think about how many statistical analyses you want to conduct before the study, plan them out, and those are the only ones that you should look at. If you look at more, you're likely to get a false positive, okay? Communicate results. Again, this is a very important part of the research process, okay? And you can communicate your results in a wide variety of ways. So you could give a talk, you could publish a research article, sometimes you might give a research poster. Oh man, this has been a while. This was my very first research conference in Boston. This is my undergraduate advisor, Gil Einstein, an amazing, amazing man. And here's my first poster presentation ever. Okay, it had to do with prospective memory to perform an action in the future. And man, I look a whole lot healthier there and a whole lot younger. And I didn't have contacts then. But that's neither here nor there. All right. Research posters are a good way to present your research to other psychologists. Maybe you give a research talk at a conference. This is another thing that you might want to do. Okay. But by far the golden standard, what you want to do as a psychologist is to publish your paper in a research journal. Okay. Research journals are published every so often. Maybe it's every month, maybe it's every 3 months, maybe it's every year. And typically they're going to have empirical research. And remember when I said about empirical research that these are articles that present new data. Maybe they have review articles, maybe they have articles in which people are proposing new theories, okay? But most research journals go through the process of peer review, like I was telling you guys earlier. You get other people that know your discipline, and you have them come up with criticisms of the study. They say whether or not they like it, whether or not they don't like it, whether or not you need to make changes in the writing. If it's a bad study, there's nothing that you can do, right? But the writing's bad. If you come up with a wrong interpretation, there's things that you can do to salvage the study, all right? Typically what happens is you submit your paper and it goes to an action editor. And the action editor is ultimately the one that makes the decision, do we allow this in the journal? Do we not allow this in the journal? All right. The action editor may or may not be familiar with the discipline. All right. They're within the same wheelhouse. So it might be, if you have social psychology, it will be a social psychologist. If you're doing cognitive psychology, it will be a cognitive psychologist. But if I submit a research study on memory, it might be somebody that does research on attention or research on decision making. So the action editor sends it out to a reviewer. Well, not just a reviewer, a few reviewers. Typically 3, although sometimes it's 2. Someone that's well-versed in your particular research topic, and they're going to make suggestions of how to improve your paper. And ultimately, they're going to say, yes, I like this research study, or no, this is garbage. All right. If your research study does not work out, if you do not get what you had predicted, all right, is it still important that you try to publish it? Yes, yes, yes. It's extremely important that you try to publish all of your research, as long as it's conducted well. Even though you don't find the research study, don't find the result that you've anticipated, it's still important to get that research out there. All right. There's something known as the file drawer problem, which is a huge problem in psychology. Articles that find a cool finding are more likely to be published than articles that don't find that cool finding. Okay. Articles that find negative results, that this effect does not exist, it's much more hard for them to get published than not. So a good example of this, I mentioned before that I did a lot of research on cognitive training. If you find that cognitive training improves your memory, everybody and their mother wants to publish your research study because it's exciting. Woo, Lumosity increases brain power. Woo, crossword puzzles improve your attention. Okay, people want to believe that. All right, if your study says that, people are more likely to publish that. If your study says, hey, I looked at this and I conducted my study well, and it turns out that there isn't this relationship there, I don't confirm things, it's going to be harder for you to publish that study. And some people just give up, all right? And they put that study in their file drawer, never to see the light of day. And this is very dangerous, all right? There are plenty of phenomenon in psychology that, you know, there's one paper that everybody cites and it's a crazy study that everybody loves, and yet people have tried to replicate it again and again and again and again and again, and it always fails. But since they don't publish it, there's about 70 research studies in someone's file drawer, but that one study might have been a false positive and it's out there and everybody cites it. Let me tell you a good example of this. This is a study by John Barge, Chin, and Burroughs. Infamous study. All right. What John Barge and colleagues do is they get you to do some attention task. But that isn't the true focus of this study. While you're doing this attention task, they're subliminally presenting you with certain words. Words that denote older adults, or words that denote that you are a younger adult. So they might be words like retirement, words like Florida. Florida, for some reason, is associated with older adults. I guess a lot of older adults go there for retirement. So retirement, Florida, maybe gray. So words that make you think of older adults. Or they primed you with words that make you think about young adults. I forget what some of these words are, right? So maybe like SpongeBob or something like that. But they're presenting them so quickly that people do not realize what the words are that they're seeing, right? They're flashed on the screen very, very briefly. All right. So after the research study is supposedly over, the subject has to walk to an elevator to get out. Unbeknownst to the subject, there is an experimenter with a stopwatch. All right. And that stopwatch, they click on when you start walking, and they click off when you make it to the elevator. They see how long it takes you to walk down that hallway. And what John Barge ends up finding, that if people are primed with the older adult words, that they take a longer period of time than when they're not primed with these words. All right. Ooh, fun finding. We prime you with the words gray, Florida, and all of a sudden you're walking more slowly. And this is for young adults, by the way. This is not older adults. These are young adults. That John Barge's whole thing is that the majority of mental processes are occurring in the unconscious. And you can prime somebody with these older words, and then all of a sudden they're going to act in a more older way. Very fun finding for a study. It's in all the textbooks, even the modern versions of these textbooks. This study is everywhere. A lot of people love this study. And it's a very cute study. The study has been tried to be replicated at least over 50 times, and everybody else cannot replicate this study. So again, this is in all the textbooks. Everybody loves this study, but nobody can replicate it. It seems to be a false positive, all right? It's just a cool finding that somebody found one time, but nobody is able to replicate it. And if everybody stuck these research studies in their file drawer, and this did happen for a long period of time, then the true answer doesn't come out. This study is not challenged. It's very important that you publish the research, even if it doesn't show the finding that you anticipated it to find. All right, so that's the research process. I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture, and I will see you soon. Have a good day.